Can you talk a little bit about your childhood? I know you
Sure,
mentioned.
yeah, I was born 1940, September 1940, which was World War II. Um, and those were not very good times, obviously. It's probably very hard to describe what it's like, um, being in a war when you have to run, when the sirens go, you have to run to air shelter. And so the first 5 years of my life, I practically spent the main time of my life in a bomb shelter. That's what it was. Uh, Obviously, at that age, you are not that frightened of it, I think you could say, but you didn't have the way of getting really a lot acquainted with friends, because they were in air shelter too, not necessarily in the same one, but I remember very well. I remember being in the air shelter and everybody sitting there and the bombs were flying outside, and it was underground because that was the safest place. And I'm sure the grown-ups were afraid that you might be buried alive. I wasn't, obviously. But I remember when my mother would grab me and run, and I would take my books, my books that I had, and I would sit there and would read, like I would reading them. Of course, I couldn't read, but I knew about the pictures and what was under it, and it was only 1 or 2 lines. So I remember that, sitting there with my books, and I felt very important that I was reading this. And then we also, eventually we had to go into a shelter permanently. We were living in there. And that's when I got sick. I got diphtheria. You know what that is? It's a bacterial disease, and it affects your breathing. It can kill you, because it creates a toxin in your body. And I remember there was a doctor, one doctor for all of the people in the shelter. And my mother was lined up with me, and I had a high fever, and she was holding me. And when we finally got to the doctor, he said, "Your daughter has diphtheria, but I have nothing." That was it.
No medicines, no.
Nothing.
Oh my gosh.
So I often wonder, people complain about, bad service and all of that. That was a whole lot more than bad service. But I survived it. And
did someone there help you with that?
well, it kind of, I remember there were a lot of old, most of them in the shelter were women, children, and old people. And I remember this old lady, she said to my mother, "I think I know something." And she gave me something. And all of this came out. And after that, the fever was gone. And so she probably saved my life.
Was it something you drank?
Yeah, she gave me something to drink. I don't know, don't ask me what it was, because I was 3.5, 4 years old. And I drank it because,
They told you to.
you do that. And I still remember the shelter, the beds, and the people huddled around. And it was very depressing, even for a 4-year-old or 3-year-old or 3.5-year-old at the time. But then after the war, my dad came back, and during the war, there was food. I mean, we were not having a bad time, but after the war, all of a sudden there was no food. It was really awful. people would exchange things if they had something. That was the good part about a war and pre-war times, because people take care of each other. Of course, when the time got better, that all fell by the wayside. Nobody cared anymore. But right after the war, I remember, if somebody had food, you would get something, and if you had a doll or something, you would give it to a kid. Yeah, it was really good.
Wow.
So I remember bad and good times. It created both good times for people to connect with each other, and I also remember the bad times because there was not much to eat. If you had bread, you were lucky, and if there was something left, I remember my mother cooking soup out of rest of bread.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And we were even fortunate because my parents' house was obviously bombed because it was in the city, and my grandmother, where my mother grew up, was on the outskirts of the city, and she had a lot of land around and had fruit trees and all of that. So we had chickens, and later on we had pigs. Because we had the room to raise the pigs and keep them, and other people would bring stuff to feed them.
Oh, yes.
And when they were ready to be slaughtered, they were, shared with everybody. And I remember my mother used to cry when they slaughtered the pig because she was the one who had to feed them, do stuff like that.
They're like little pets.
Yeah, I remember the chickens, and I also remembered that was better, neighborhood kids, and we were all friends and play with each other, and there was no crime. Obviously, you could go everywhere. Our parents didn't have to worry about us. We were just running around, and of course there were bad things too. One of my friends, he found a landmine, and he played with it, and it blew him up.
Oh, that's horrible.
Yeah, he was 2 years older than I am. I remember him.
Oh.
And fortunately, at the time when he found it, we were usually all together, and at that time I wasn't with them, and it killed him.
Oh, that's horrible.
He was blown to pieces. It was just awful.
Which part of Germany were you in?
I was born and raised, and my family always lived on the left side of the Rhine River. There's a small section that borders to Belgium and Holland, while almost 90% of Germany is on the other side of the Rhine. So I always lived in that section until I got married. That it changed because my husband was from southern Germany, and we moved there. I moved there. He didn't.
So your grandmother was on the left side as well, her land?
Oh yeah, my grandfather was already dead by then. He died before I was born. But my grandmother and my mother and I, we lived with my grandmother. Yeah. Something younger than me. No.
Wow, very interesting. The candy bars that they brought you, were they German candy bars, or were they candy bars from other
they
countries?
were, I think most of it came from here. Oh. At school, everything was bombed to pieces, so the schools too, they didn't care. They threw the bombs wherever they would, fall. So the first 2 years of when I started school, we had shifts. We would 1 week we could go in the morning, and the other half would go in the afternoon. And the next week, the ones that were in the morning would go in the afternoon, and vice versa. So I remember that. And the classes were large. obviously, because there were not many teachers because they were all killed in the war because they were younger, and so they brought back all the old teachers that were already retired. But they made us learn, and there was always no paper. We had slate things with one, like a tablet, and one side had a grid, the other side had lines, and you had a thing that was used to write on it, and you wipe it out when you don't need it, and that's how I learned how to read and write.
Wow.
So we all had this, it was slate. And you could wipe it and write on it again. Very efficient because you don't have paper, nothing was thrown away,
Right.
Yeah. And that was how I started school. And then my dad finished his business, we moved back into the city, and I went to a different school. And by then I think we had paper and books again and all of that. But I think having these old teachers and all of that, they did a terrific job. I mean, nobody was left behind, everybody learned very well, and the schools were doing the best they could under the circumstances. And in Germany it was the way it was set up. When you were 10 years old, they would divide the kids, the one that would go to further education and the one who stayed with the basic education, which was until 16, and the other one is until 18 or 19. So you had to take a test for 2 days.
Oh, wow.
And then if you would pass the test, you could get into that lane. And my parents always wanted me to go there. So that's where I went. But then I had to go a long, long way.